Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's wellness session on improving communication. With us, we have the amazing Dr. Rose Shelton today, who will be facilitating today's session. So grab a pen, a notebook, and get ready for some healthy conversation and tips on communication. I won't take up too much of your time. I'm going to pass it right over to Dr. Rose Shelton. Dr. Shelton, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Can you hear me? I didn't lose anything? Okay. All right. So today we are discussing improving communication. If you have any questions along the way, you can put your information or your question in the chat, and I will be stopped along the way if necessary. Otherwise, I will definitely take questions at the end. I try not to take up the whole time with information and give time and space for actual interaction. So let's start with just talking about what communication actually is. So communication is a process of passing information, which is sending, and understanding that same information, which is receiving, from one person to another through verbal and nonverbal means. And nonverbal is really important. A lot of times we think communication is about words, but words are actually just a small part of communication. Nonverbal is actually more a part of the process of communication than the actual words. And that's really important to understand too, especially in a country like ours, where we have so many different languages and cultures that are present in our communities, that we have to sometimes understand that what people are actually reading from us is not so much our words, because our words may not be communicating effectively, but what it is that we are sending with our energy and our body. And we also have to remember that covert and overt implications and inferences are also really important for some people to be mindful of, because that is how they stay safe. That is how they understand real intention and meaning, and also how they make sure they are fully present or decide not to be as present as they otherwise would be by reading the nonverbal and not just the word. Communication is important to human beings because it's the way we share information. We share our senses, we share our knowledge, we give assurance, we give value, self-worth, and with our words, we can also take that away. Your words are the most powerful thing you have, and it can be used to build, destroy, negate, and unify. And that's why communication is something we should all be focusing on a day-to-day basis. The importance of effective communication. So effective communication, the effective is the part that we're focusing on, because at some point we're all talking, right? But talking is not actual communication. Communication is literally sending and receiving messages. Effective communication is making sure whatever it is that you're sending is being received in the way that you're intending it to be received. Doesn't matter how great our thoughts are, how great our ideas are, if we don't learn how to effectively communicate our thoughts and the expectations and the hopes for outcomes and how we want people to engage in that process, then the effectiveness of that communication and interaction actually is not present. So there is a difference between talking. Talking is really about expressing ourselves. It's about sharing ourselves. Sometimes it's just for the fun of it. We like to talk, right? It is a thing that we do, whether we're sitting or standing or like, no matter what, somehow talking is a part of it. So we enjoy talking. But talking is different than dialoguing. Dialoguing is what you do when you are in depth with the information you're sending and receiving. It's about exploration. It's, if we could look at kind of like the iceberg, that sometimes you see the top of the iceberg. The talking is the top of the iceberg. Underneath that body of water is that larger piece of ice. That is dialogue. That is that depth, that thing that we don't sometimes see. It has different meanings for everyone. It is uncovering that which is not obvious from the top of what we're talking about. And those two things are also different than storytelling. From interacting just because we're sitting next to someone on a bus. And so they're all different ways that we're in communication, but not effectively communicating and sending and receiving messages for an expected impact and outcome. And sometimes that's crucial to understand, because sometimes you'll have people like, I talk to them every day. I talked with them yesterday. But did we actually effectively communicate the intention of that interaction, or were we just kind of dialoguing or talking, but not really sending forth a message that we're expecting a reaction or an outcome? So who is a part of communication? To understand communication and its and the movement of the words, we have to understand that communication actually has a lot to do with us, with who we are. We are bringing ourselves, we are bringing our visions, our belief systems, our histories, our hopes into the space of communication. We are communing, right? We are literally bringing ourselves, and the other person, they are bringing who they are. So who I am is actually present in the moment that we are interacting, and the words are just kind of presenting and hopefully assisting us in what it is that we're trying to bring together, whether it be ourselves, ideas, whatever it may be. So who I am in communication and who you are in communication, and our belief systems, our histories, all of those things are ever present in the very moment of communication. This information is also filtered through what we call the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind is a culmination of everything we are and everything we have ever been. But in that, it is informing our conscious mind of existence through generalizations. What does all that mean? It means that if we could kind of split up our mind into parts, there would be the conscious, what we call the prefrontal cortex, the conscious mind that actually has us interacting. It's the part of the mind that has us to rationalize and reason. It allows us to be present in the moment. But if we were to pay attention to how the mind is split up, that's only 10% of what's actually being utilized in the moment, right? So that's willpower, that's short-term memory, that's logical thinking and critical thinking. But what is actually driving the moments of our lives when we are communicating is the subconscious mind. And the subconscious mind is 90% of what's driving. There are some people that say it's a 20-80 split or it's a 10-90 split. Either way, your conscious mind is very small in comparison. And everything that you have ever believed, all of your emotions, your habits, your values, your protective reactions, your long-term memory, imagination, and intuition is driving how you interact or fail to interact in relationship with people when communicating. That's also why nonverbal communication is so important and is informing us, and why we should be mindful of the nonverbal communication we're presenting, because people are picking up through their intuition or from their long-term memory or their own value systems, and trying to process what is it this person actually means when they're saying what it is that they're saying, or do they really mean what it is that they're saying? Because if I have a history of people doing or saying these things, but they don't actually mean it, or they say it in this way and it has this specific meaning, that is informing how this person is interacting. And sometimes their reaction is informing how I am responding. So being mindful of are we allowing our subconscious to really dictate, or are we being present in the moment to allow the person and this message to present itself without bias is really important in learning how to effectively communicate. So what is informing these generalizations? So generalizations of the subconscious mind that establishes the rationalizations through reasoning tell us that what we believe is true. What we believe about ourselves and what we believe about others is true. The thing is, it's true for you. It might be true for the other person, but that does not mean it's an actual truth, right? But there's so much going on. Life is big. There's billions of people. You're not going to be able to understand, process, rationalize, or reason about every single person, every situation, every circumstance. Even right now, wherever we are, there are radio waves, there are light waves, there's all kinds of things filtering through the room that you cannot see. There are noises that might be in the background that you have logically been able to like push in the back because you're not focusing on it. The mind has an amazing way of compartmentalizing, focusing, rationalizing, and reasoning so that it can make sense of the large capacity and complexity of life. The thing about that is that it does not actually give us real truth. It just gives us enough information to make sense of moments so that we can move, so that we can communicate, so that we can understand the moment or the person or people at hand and make sense of all of that. So with deductive reasoning, a lot of times what we are doing, and with inductive reasoning, what we're doing is taking large information and we are generalizing it to either, we can either do a top-down approach or a bottom-down approach. So with deductive, it's a top-down approach. And deductive means kind of like, for an example, all students in the room play guitar. Since Sam is in the room, Sam must play guitar. In inductive, it is if the quiz is easy, and all of the quizzes up to this point are easy, therefore the test tomorrow will also be easy. That is a generalization. These are generalizations based off of information, subconscious information that have been established from patterns. The thing is, we do this in life, and we do it with people, and we do it with organizations. If I worked in a law firm, I know what all law firms feel like when you work there, right? If I have, met someone from Guatemala, I know how all people think in Guatemala, right? So we do these rationalizations and these generalizations because they have made sense for us. Maybe we have also met 2 or 3 people or worked at more than one organization that felt the same way. And so it kind of solidified that general bias thought based off of our experience. The thing is, when we go in to meet someone else or have communication, we bring that with us. And sometimes we'll miss actually meeting the person or hearing what they're saying because we're so driven by that 90% that's telling us what to think and feel about this person and this moment, this situation, circumstance, or even this environment. All right. So communication styles are actually informed by our identities. And it is informed by the things that make sense to us. And that can be personally, that can also be organizational wise. So personally, as we were saying, who I am is present in communication and who the other person is. And these things are informed by culture, religion, spirituality, traditions, social structures, societal structures, organizational structures, career paths, the roles we play in our organization, the positions we have held throughout our careers, education, it could be social economic status, it could be a lot of different things, right? So these things inform how we communicate, the styles that we communicate in, the ways we believe we're supposed to communicate. But that does not mean that when we go somewhere else, that another way of communicating, another style, the needs of the other person might be different. So it's really hard to balance who I am and who others are, because we're constantly living in our complex existence. So we have to find a way to kind of counter ourselves and figure out a way to make space for others. That usually happens with interaction, which is why communication also is about learning and being present, being mindful in the moments that we're interacting with people so that we can get to know individuals, being mindful when we're in organizations so we can understand organizational culture and not lead from our own understanding, right? One of the reasons this is also important as we open back up from the pandemic is that a lot of us have found refuge in these systems, right? So we have kind of double, triple down in our social, systemic, traditional, cultural, religious, whatever they are. We have found refuge in that and sometimes spend all day, every day in those things. And we have not built real relationships with others outside of that. And we have not built real relationships, even with those that we have been working with. It's been a kind of flat, maybe a Zoom here and there, lots of emails, texting, and message sending. So there's no real relationship bond that counters how we think and how we feel about ourselves or others. So being mindful that just because I think and feel this way doesn't mean that I can project that out is the way that it is and should be. And giving space to see how others think and feel and how they process and understand so that when we are communicating, we're not preventing people from wanting to interact, for them to feel that they may not be able to trust us because it doesn't feel like there's room for them having a different way of thinking or a different opinion. So being mindful that when we're not rejecting words and thoughts, but sometimes we are rejecting whole individuals that have stories for the way that they think and feel and how they operate. Barriers to communication, and we kind of talked about the complexity of how we are. Those same complex aspects of us that make us so great and wonderful can also be the exact same thing that make us not so wonderful to someone else when we're trying to communicate, because these things can sometimes get in the way. So then what are communication barriers? Communication barriers are anything within your organization or within yourself that prevents people from receiving or understanding messages, ideas, and information. These barriers can also prevent messages from being sent effectively, causing a disconnect within the company and amongst staff, as well as amongst friendships and familyships. When there's no identifiable plan or solution for addressing barriers, it starts to negatively impact multiple areas of a business and our personal lives. It can trickle down from executives, managers, and even down to the teams. And personally, it can start in your individual home, and then next thing you know, it's cousins, family, neighbors, all of those, just because we sometimes feel it. We're not being seen and heard, instead of understanding there might be a different way to be seen and heard, right? Those communication barriers. So miscommunication can quickly create issues, leading to negative impacts on morale, on productivity, employee engagement, trust, connection, especially personally, interrelational as well as interpersonal, creating a lot of negative self-talk instead of understanding that it just might be the way that we're communicating instead of this is personal about me. Communication feels very personal because we are personally showing up, and like I was showing, a lot of who we are is showing up in that. But communication is personal to you as well as it is to the other person. So kind of recognizing that even when it feels like something personal is happening to me, It may just be the way that we are seeing things and having different perspectives and ways that we're communicating, but that does not mean that you are not important in the process or someone is devaluing you because they really don't understand how you are communicating or why the things that you're communicating are valuable to you. They have their own values as well, right? So how do we find a way to connect? For organizations, this is really interesting because a survey was done recently on 400 companies that had over 100,000 employees. Each cited an average loss in the company of $62.4 million per year due to inadequate communication to and between employees. This is not just about like hierarchy, right? This isn't just different levels, but just between the employees themselves, it had an overall impact on the bottom line. So if we can kind of quantify it with dollars, imagine what this is like in value of life, right? And in our lives, time and energy, yes, sometimes our money as well. All of that also is important to us the same way dollars are important to companies. So just imagine if we can quantify it with a business, how is this loss translating itself in our personal lives? Because we're not figuring out ways to effectively communicate. So these barriers that we talked about, cultural differences in language, conflicts in workplace, communication styles, lack of transparency, inability to listen to others, and dissatisfaction and disinterest with one's job. And that's really important because once you're out of school, right? School was your life. When you're an adult, your job is your life. So if that is the thing you're doing most of the day and it is not satisfactory, that will cause a lot of frustration. It will cause the brain to kind of shrink and its ability to communicate becomes lessened because it triggers the emotional brain. And the emotional brain doesn't have a whole lot of language. It just has a lot of feeling. And so the logical part that allows you to communicate and re-engage, it gets overwhelmed. And we kind of like shut down the rest of the parts of our lives. So barriers are interpersonal and sometimes within organizations. Emotional barriers, really huge right now to think about because the pandemic has impacted us on so many levels, but definitely emotionally and mentally. Language barriers are also huge, and physical barriers. Physical barriers and emotional barriers can sometimes work together in creating breakdown, because if I am in a hybrid work environment or if I'm a virtual work environment, right, that is a physical barrier where I'm not in relation with people in close proximity. So I'm trying to figure out what it is that they mean through their emails or in the quick moments that we do have together. And sometimes that can feel emotionally frustrating, right? When you don't respond or you get back to me, and sometimes I don't even realize maybe you're a caretaker of elderly parents, maybe you're a caretaker of younger children. While you're in that virtual space, all I know is I'm not getting a response. But if I were in the office, you would be responding, right? So sometimes we're creating barriers and then we create stories on why this might be happening, why they don't respond to me. And so then we get frustrated and have a lot of thoughts and feelings about individuals. So that also creates communication issues. So communication skills, some people are not very good at communicating what's going on with them and why they are not responding or connecting, or why they are just over it, right? So that's an honest thing. So communication skills, psychological, there are lots of people that did extremely well in the pandemic. They were finally out of traffic, out of the hustle and bustle, out of very, very unhealthy office dynamics, right? They were able to just do their work, allow themselves to be fully present and create and do the things that they have to do without all the other stuff. And then there are others that did not do so well. And the connection, toxic or not, it was connection. And they could find their little one or two co-workers and do coffee or do whatever it was, or happy hour or brunch. And that was enough to still give them value in life. So everyone's going to have a different way that they're experiencing the way we're coming back out of the pandemic. But psychological impacts in the way that we process life definitely can create barriers. And when people have biased thoughts about well-being and counseling and therapy and medication, and you don't feel like you can talk about those things, that can also cause you to kind of hide or not being honest about some things, and also allow yourself to kind of go through spirals by yourself because you don't feel like you have spaces and places. So that also creates disengagement. So organizational structures can be issues, lack of trust, infrequent information overload. I had so many clients that we had to learn how to put in healthy boundaries because for whatever reason, people thought because we were at home, we had unlimited time to do work. When in actuality, the only thing you gained during the pandemic was travel time. You still had to go to the bathroom, you still had to eat. This time you had to make your food and you just could not buy it and pick it up somewhere, right? So you actually do not have as much time at home if you had children or elderly parents or someone else, moving in because someone lost home or could not pay rent. And you've got multiple things happening in your home. There was not more time, right? Every once in a while, there were a few people that had too much time, but that did not mean that was true for everyone. So there was a lot of information overload, a lot of requirements of people's time and energy beyond the scope. So that was an issue and will be an issue as we move back into offices and trying to figure out what that balance is. Lack of unified channels to discuss some of these things, cultural differences, selective sharing, no personalization in communication processes, all can be barriers and cause a lot of mental and emotional distress. Ways to overcome communication barriers in the workplace. This can be for you personally as well, but definitely in the workplace. I call these my 3 Ps. And so everyone processes differently, right? And I've said that a million times. Some of us hear things, some of us visualize what we're hearing. Some of us can imagine. It's hard for people to believe, but everyone that can visualize can imagine, and everyone that imagines can't visualize, right? So some people feel what you're saying and then can process it internally, which is why email and texting and messaging might come across very flat for some individuals. They're not able to feel it. It's hard for them to visualize what you're saying, right? So we have to kind of take into consideration everyone that's in the process of communication to make sure we're kind of making sense. And if not, giving them a pathway to come back and ask questions where it's not a, oh my God, I've already told you, right? Like giving people space and place to really clarify, understand, and make sense of things, because that's going to get us all on the same page. And if we're all on the same page, we're not having to do this 2, 3, 4 different times. And the person who's not getting it is not kind of lagging behind on their progress because they're afraid to ask for clarification, while everyone else that speaks and understands language the same way as the person who's leading this project also, does, right? So recognize generational gaps and other differences. Gather feedback from your people around messaging. Does it work for them or not? Where are we losing them? How can we better support? Do they understand when one person speaks versus another person? That's a real thing, right? Some people can articulate things where it is a visual conversation. Even when I'm working with clients, when they're like, I just feel, and others are like, I just think. They're literally telling me where they process, right? They're telling me how they're communicating with the world and how the world is communicating with them. And so if we miss it and we're like, well, you have to just get on our page, we're actually creating a barrier, and they're going to fall right into the line of whatever bias we have that they can't do when we're actually creating a way for them not to be able to do, right? Develop consistency in communication efforts. personalize information and messages, encourage more two-way information sharing. It's not just a information drop and you figure it out. Allow ourselves to be questioned, allow ourselves to be to have questions for clarification. When we sometimes are operating in those roles in our career paths, we are given these thoughts and beliefs that we are above reproach, right? We're supposed to be heard. We are supposed to be followed, but that doesn't really work with everyone. Most people, even if they have learned how to play the game, it's still creating a process where you can't be trusted. You can't be trusted with who I am, right? You can only be trusted with my work. So me being valued in this dynamic doesn't really exist. So I'm going to give you what I need to make this work, but I'm never going to give you more than that, right? So sometimes people have to remember that, as they say, do you want to be respected or loved? You don't have to be one or the other. You can have appreciation and value for people and still be respected, right? So we want to create paths for communication, and in that path, create processes that people can follow along that path for communication. And then we want to create a pattern of utilizing this process so that it becomes normalized and people can trust and depend on this pathway, knowing that they will be seen, heard, and allowed to be a part of the process of communication and getting things done and impacting the outcome in a very effective way. So the 4 powers of communication. I spoke about talking, right? Talking is about really expressing yourself. That's the first power. You're expressing yourself as part of communicating. And then there's the listening and responding. This is starting to make it more about the dialoguing and starting to be an effective movement, and right? An effect, right? And an effect means we're trying to create an outcome. We're trying to have impact with intention. So in the second power with the listening and responding, we're starting to develop where we're moving toward an effective movement, right? To affect an outcome. The third power is regulating attention and intention and showing emotional intelligence. Sometimes people want to be heard and want to be followed. Some people don't like to be questioned. And sometimes, because we are presenting ourselves, some individuals don't like the pushback because it feels like full rejection, or it feels like you're devaluing their knowledge and wisdom. Emotional intelligence development and communication is really important, especially when you are playing pivotal roles in people's lives and in a leadership position, because we are all human, and it really doesn't matter what your title is or what your role is. You're still affecting and impacting people in general, and we should not have titles. And we should not have dollar signs that give value. We should understand people have value because they're here playing a part in whatever it is that we're doing, right? So emotional intelligence that allows you to understand that people are present, not just words, not just a project, right? Not just the outcome. There are people that are part of this process to make this happen. The fourth power is understanding and responding to people within their style or frame of reference. Like I said, we don't know everything. We don't know how to communicate. We can assume, right? But those are biases that sometimes create barriers. So really taking time to get to know people and seeing how they work. I used to have a manager who used to always say when I was in the military, you don't put a round peg in a square hole. You don't put a square peg in a round hole. And what he was telling us is you have to really know your soldiers. What are they good at? It doesn't matter that they've been promoted to this. It doesn't matter that, someone was in an office moving people by numbers and putting them in these positions. Are they good at it? Do they need more training, right? So pay attention to who your people are, because if you know who your people are and you maximize who they are and their abilities, they will not only learn all the other things you need them to know, but who they are will be will be brought to the forefront so wonderfully. It will allow you to do even more things than you could have without taking the time to know that. Right? So some people, their communication styles are analyzers. Some people are really good with numbers and information. Some people are socializers. They know people, they move people. They can get people to do things that you can't, right? Sometimes they are sensitive and nurturing. There are those that are relators. They can just relate to anything, anyone. They're very flexible. They're adaptive, right? And then there are those that are very direct. They are not adapting to very much of anything. And whatever they say, it is what it is. There's no reading between the lines, right? But how do we get all of this to work and make sense for all of us instead of fighting each other, right? Effective communication is literally where the intention of being effective to get an outcome. So communication skill is really a multi-level experience. It is thinking, it is listening, it is speaking, it is nonverbal communication as well. One other thing that I wanted to, let me go right back. So who we are by default, we can't always change, right? So our communication styles and the way that we listen and process information actually starts to develop when we're children. We can learn by, being in jobs or being on sports teams. We can learn how to be open and receptive to other ways of communicating and making sure we don't take it personal, right? We can learn that. But who we are and how we default in processing information can't actually be changed, which is why we make space for others and don't take it personal. So what happens a lot of times, we will have assumptions and try to make people change themselves, and that will always create failure. And then it will create resentment and frustration, and then that can oftentimes create fallout. But when people have grown up processing information and it being inferred or it being very direct, that's still going to be their first nature of communicating and processing. So having conversations with people to say, this is great, I understand, but can you speak this way, or can you address it this way, or can you maybe do it in multiple ways, is going to be really important, because sometimes in that subconscious processing, we can trigger the rejection, the bias, the devaluing of people when we are operating in ways that they have been used to operating in, positively or negatively, right? So that's why I always keep saying and always bringing back to people, it's not personal, but we have to be personally responsible to be mindful, right? Communication is a mindful process. Communication, especially in workplaces, this is how much time we spend in our day if we have a job communicating. And communication is really important because what does it and who does it impact? It impacts actually the people. The people are getting the work done. The people are moving projects along, right? So it's not just the words and it's not just the project. It's making sure we are motivating, valuing, investing in people and who they are, to build better relationships that can create better outcomes for our overall organization and in their personal lives, right? If they're seen and heard all day or understood or a part of something all day, they will feel valued enough to also be exactly who they need to be for their families and not try to gain all the value they feel was ripped out of them through the day, right? So we spend this amount of time communicating, 33% listening, 26% speaking, 22% writing about all the things we listened and spoke about. All right, so most of our day is in some form or fashion of communication. So all of this, great, wonderful, nonverbal, the written, the presentations, having compassion, understanding personal connections, building trust, all of that is great. And the way that you really establish this effectiveness and make all of this make sense and work out for you is to have active listening. Active listening is the only way you will really get to know someone and remove and overcome some of our own preconceived biases and misunderstandings of individuals and groups. Active listening is making the speaker feel heard, listening to remember and listen for underlying meaning, clarifying understanding. Practice the process as many times as you can. I make people literally practice in my process. Practice failing, because that's the only way you're going to know what does and does not work. You should never be afraid of failing if you're trying, because that's the only way you're going to uncover biases and understand what actually makes sense and works for the people that you are around. So you need self-awareness, you need empathy for others. So self-awareness for self, empathy for others, the intention to build trust and relationship, and be adaptive to whatever comes out of that process. So we have to have a great attitude, right? Come into the conversation with the right attitude. Consider if you're emotionally open to the conversation and able to devote your attention to what the other person is saying, you're going to have a better outcome, a great start. Attention. You need active listening involves giving your undivided attention to the person speaking. If there will be distractions, find a way to not distract yourself so that you don't miss key information. Adjustments, making adjustments to the information you've heard. If you come in and I'm giving all of this and you're like, at the end of this, it's still going to be a straight no, right? Like that's not adjusting. Now it still might be a no, right? But you can still give attention to what the person has said and say, I understand, that makes a lot of sense, value, and these are the reasons I'm still going to make this decision, or why the company's going. It's not that you're not valuable. It's not that we want to shut you down. It's not that we're tired of you giving suggestions, but we're valuing that, right? We're going to give that attention and value. And then we're also going to adjust to what is said and also whatever the outcome should be or needs to be after that conversation. And it might be a total redirect once we know how everyone else is being impacted, or how the outcome could be different with this new information. Reflective response and reflective listening. So we're going to reflect back to the individual what we have heard them say, right? We're going to show that we've been listening carefully. In that adjustment, or in that response to what it is that they've been saying. We're going to repeat back to them important key points and mental notes we have picked up by actively listening to what they have said, and not kind of stuck into what we want to say or what we believe should be from the get. We're going to realize and notice how we're feeling with this process, right? Are we kind of like balled up because we really are in a defensive mode, or are we open to what it is the individuals are saying? Have we put ourselves, by kind of reassessing, have we put ourselves in the shoes of the other person in the situation that they're talking about? Or are we still kind of protecting ourselves with wanting to be right and the only one with the answers, right? So being mindful of all those things as we active listen will help us to be reflective in our listening and have reflective responses based off what the other person has presented, and not based off of what it is that we have perceived as good, right, and important. So in this process of doing all of these things, I think I missed one. These are examples of the reflective listening responses. It sounds like, it seems as if, it sounds like you were really feeling, right? All of these are reflective listening responses after we have active listened to the person. And these are really good because they do a couple of things. It not only lets the person know that you heard them, It helps you to be clear on what it is that they're saying. And then I always tell people, when you're doing these, when you're doing the active listening, to make sure you're breathing, right? When we're checking in to kind of check our bodies, we're trying to check also to see if we're breathing, right? You want to make sure you're breathing, because if you're breathing, you're receiving. If you're not breathing, you're not receiving, you are deflecting. And these types of reflective listening responses allow the conversation to be about the message and not allowing my kind of subconscious processings to come in and dictate this conscious moment, right? So we want to breathe. We want to ground ourselves in the actual conversation and moment, and not allow the dictation of the past, but the clarification and the reasoning and rationalization of this moment, to see if what we believe in some of our generalizations, do they actually make sense now? Or am I being given more or different information to have a different view, a different outcome, a different direction, right? So pausing and breathing allows you to disconnect from the subconscious, be present in the moment, be present around the information, connect. And also that allows the brain to open up and receive information, to logically process other options instead of the one that we came in with, and allow ourselves to really interact, and this not be an emotional response process, but a logical present moment experience. With all of these things, what this does for us is helps us create pathways of effective communication based off of all the things we've kind of talked about, taking into consideration barriers, taking into consideration people do have different styles and different ways of processing and interacting. So with effective communication, what we want to do for ourselves, and sometimes in our organizations, or most of the time in our organizations, is establish paths of communication. How can people communicate with you? How can you communicate with others? What does that path look like? Are there distractions during that time? Are you being attentive? Like, what is the pathway to make sure the communication is effective and intentional when necessary? What are the processes in making that happen, right? Personally, is it that we do it on a Friday, you know, at a happy hour, or do we do it on a Thursday, you know, at dinner, or at the dinner table and all electronics are shut down? At work, is it on a Monday morning where everyone's just getting started, right? And we kind of go through and process and allow people to bring everything to the table to prepare for the week. And then we give plans to make sure everyone knows who's supposed to be available and why, and all of those things. So what are the processes that we are establishing within this path of communication? And then what is the pattern that we're going to do, right? Is it an every week thing? Is it an every other day we're going to check in until we establish a pattern and practice this pathway until it becomes our first nature? Any questions?
No questions, but just a comment. I think this was such a meaty discussion. I was jotting down so many different points. And even as you began, you just spoke about, you know, even like those that we speak to regularly, that, you know, we may not even understand that our communication is, maybe our style is not getting across. It's not because we speak to somebody on a regular basis, it means we're communicating effectively. And that, you know, it brought up feelings in myself to say, like, you know, sometimes when we communicate, or I personally communicate, I often say like, oh, you know, I wonder if they understood, or I wonder if they got what I was saying. Or sometimes I don't feel understood in a conversation with somebody that I regularly engage with. And, you know, it's kind of making sense now. And, you know, the active listening, I mean, I have scribbled so many notes, but then also encouraging the two-way conversation, and knowing that sometimes when you reject an idea, that the individual can feel rejected in that, and trying to differentiate that when you're having that conversation in the follow-up, like, I hear you, I understand what you're saying. But here are my reasons for, my reaction or my decision, and then basing it to the individual, just so they know, like, this doesn't have anything to do with you personally, So I just wanted to thank you, because it was just so many great things that was discussed during this short 1-hour session. I'm like, we need a course on this, obviously, but I appreciate you, Dr. Shelton. I'll open the floor up for any other questions or comments.
I have a comment. I'm
Oh.
sorry. I have a comment. Last week, over the weekend, I buried my father. And during his funeral arrangement, my siblings and I was stuck in the middle, because it was different forms of different communications. People felt they was left out. Some people felt like they were not needed. It was a whole bunch of different, and I'm like, I'm the one, I feel like I was stuck in the middle. I'm like almost like the middle child, like, she said this, she said, I appreciate that, I want this, I want that. I'm like, okay, but we all grieving, let's breathe. Well, let's come collectively, and it's okay, because we want Poppy to go off beautifully. Just, okay, different people have different forms of communications, like as you expressed, but I'm just spending time in mourning. It all went out the door. So some people were angry, some people were sad. It was a hot mess, but eventually we all came together and everything came out beautifully.
And a lot of times in that situation, what we're not realizing is we're all fighting for the exact same thing. We're going about it in different ways. So anger and sadness actually are different sides of the exact same coin, right? But everyone's fighting for the exact same thing. But yes, it's different ways that we're communicating and trying to get it. So then that's where we're kind of like, okay, I see, I hear, but what is the goal? And as you said, the goal was to grieve and to send your dad off. Right. So if that is the goal, let's all kind of breathe and focus on that. And then we can start to really start to connect with everybody else for whatever it is that they need. But as a collective, let's come together on the one goal, the one vision we have right now.
Thank you. I saw Donna G.
If I may, I just wanted to say, sometimes I feel like in communicating with other people, we get so caught up in just simply, I don't know if it's necessarily trying to be heard or understood by the other person, that sometimes we even get lost. Or I know it happens to me. We kind of get lost in trying to just kind of force them almost to understand where we're coming from or what we're feeling or what. And then I kind of find myself sometimes wrapped up in this whole storm of oh, but I don't know if you understand me, or did you get the point? Did you understand what I was trying to express? And the other person's just kind of like, I have no idea now, because you've given me so much information. So I just, I found a lot of this very helpful, and it's going to, I guess, help me be able to kind of reflect a little bit and kind of look at myself in another light, I guess you would say, when I'm trying to communicate either the way I feel or what I think or my opinion or whatever it is to other people. So it was very helpful. Thank you.
No problem. So the emotional mind does this. Well, the mind itself does this. It can't stop thinking. It's a survival mechanism and it's a thinking mechanism. But the emotional mind, it can bring up a lot of thoughts really quickly.
Yes.
And I always say, just imagine like your mind, a neighborhood, right? And a message comes in, the first house is the emotional mind. Logic lives way down the street, right? So it stops at the emotional mind and it's like, oh my goodness, blah, 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 right? And the message is still trying to get to logic, but right now emotion is like having a field day. So a lot of times that's what it is. You can kind of do the same breathing and say, okay, what is my point? What is my goal? Because the other person, they don't know how to ride that train. They get lost on it. So, and then sometimes I tell people to write out, like if you're about to have a really deep conversation, write it out, let the emotion come up first. And eventually you'll come to the logic or the point, the goal, and then you can articulate that. But that doesn't mean you can't still kind of allow the train to roll after you get the point out.
Yeah, and one other thing I think I can say, especially personally, happens to me sometimes, is we don't take the time to necessarily stop from running our mouth to try and make our points to the other person, to just listen and receive information from them, to then understand ourselves that they actually have understood what we're trying to express, but because we're so busy trying to, oh, blah, 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 you know what I mean? And like you said, our emotions are the first things that start going crazy. I know it happens to me. I tend to be a very emotional person. That we don't just say, okay, hold on one second. Let me just give them a chance to speak and to kind of give me feedback, and then, save myself a lot of grief from, just trying to overly express myself when it's not even necessary. So.
All right.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank you so
you.
much,
Thank
Dr.
you,
Shelton.
everyone.
I
Thank
totally
you.
understand you having to go. We appreciate having you
Thank you.
today. We hope to have you back in the near future. To all that joined, we thank you for your transparency and openness. Just to piggyback off of what Dr. Shelton was saying about boundaries, we also have a healthy boundary session happening next week, Thursday at 4 p.m. and we'll be sending out that information to you guys to log on as well about defining and setting healthy boundaries. And I think, it all falls in line with healthy communication, just like what Dr. Shelton said. We will have to know if we're practicing these and we see the people that we're communicating with are not necessarily, wanting to change. That's where we have to now learn these tools about setting and defining what healthy boundaries are, not for the other person, but for us, right? And this is what we are working on, especially as we get back out into society and we engage with more people again. It's not just for our family members and loved ones. It's not just for our coworkers and colleagues. It's for anybody that we interact with in community. We want to make sure that we're being received, we're receiving people in the same way, but also being mindful for ourselves, our own growth, our personal peace and journeys, and our own self-love. So I really encourage you to join us next Thursday at 4 p.m. Just to come back, if you received the text message, if you were on our Facebook events page and saw the information, you will see that information pop up for next week's session as well. And jump on, because it will be great.
Absolutely.